Testing. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So we are discussing 1 John and what the subject of the book is, not necessarily looking at individual verses particularly or trying to look at little sentences, but trying to look at what John is dealing with in the book as a whole. And I think that's how, and I want to just repeat a few things that I've talked about in this class over the last couple of weeks, but want to go over them. So I think that is how we should read or we should study the Bible. It doesn't have to be the only way, but I think it ought to be our primary way. I think we ought to be looking at and trying to determine what do these authors, what did they intend to say? I think that too many times we take the Bible in pieces, we chop it all up into little pieces, we grind it up into ground meat, we make it like peanut butter and try to spread it on a piece of toast to the edges of our predetermined ideas. And so we just look for phrases in the Bible that we can make to mean what we want them to mean. And I just think that's just a very wrong-headed approach to understanding the Bible. It would be the wrong approach to understanding any piece of literature. I mean, if you were to take any piece of literature, whether it be a work of fiction, or if you were to take a historical work, or anything like that, and you were to take it and just say, I'm going to just extract sentences or fragments of sentences, and then I'm going to make them mean what I think they ought to mean, well, that would be you'd never understand anything you read. If that's how you studied math, or if that's how you read a novel, nothing would ever make any sense. And yet it seems like when we come to the Bible, Christianity is determined that's how you study the Bible. You go around and you do a word study. And so what that means is you find a word and you just look for every time that word appears in the entire Bible, and that's what that doctrine is. I don't think that ever comes out to anything of much use at all. I think that there is certain benefit in observing how one author might use a word. Like if we want to look at how Paul would use a word or a phrase, there's some benefit there because there's some consistency. But to say we're going to take how Paul uses a word, and then we're going to take Matthew, and we're going to take Moses, and that's how they all use that word, that's just silly. I mean, it really is. In my opinion, that's just silly. I think that we ought to be reading the Scriptures in their context. That means in the book context. So if you're reading Romans, that's the context. Romans is the context. And you can expand that and say, okay, Galatians talks a lot like that. So there might be, we can look at that, but with caution because it's not exactly the same, and so on. And I think that's how we ought to be reading the Bible. And I think this is a much more difficult, a much slower approach to the piecemeal, just grabbing little fragments wherever you can find them and shoving them together and saying, this is what it's talking about. And really what it means is, this is what I already thought, and this is how I can prove that it's true. And it's called proof texting, is generally what that system is called. It's where you just go out and find little proofs, wherever you can find them, for things you already believe. I think it's the wrong way to approach how you study the Bible. I think we ought to figure out what these books are talking about. And so that's what we've been trying to do in 1 John. Now, I believe 1 John is dealing with what we call now epistemology. He didn't call it that, but that's what we call it today, which is the study of truth. How do you know the things that you know? And that's what we call epistemology. And that's a branch of philosophy nowadays where philosophers that deal with this are concerned with not what we know, but how do we know that? And so that's what they deal with. And we're not dealing with philosophy, but John deals with Christian truth in 1 John like this. So he's not talking about what things are true in Christianity. He's talking about how do you know they're true. And that's what he deals with, and we went through that in the first chapter, and he basically says that. This is how you can know the things that you know. And that's very important. Because we all know things, and we have realized that in our life we have known things that were not true. And if I were to ask any one of you, you could probably give me a considerable list of items or of facts that at one point in your life you knew it, and then you found out what you knew wasn't true. And then this isn't just about spiritual matters. I mean, this is about everything. This could be about what happened yesterday. Or it could be about what you think is going to happen tomorrow. And you're just sure that you know something. What somebody said or somebody else did. And you're sure you know what they said. And then you find out what you knew wasn't true. Well, John is very concerned. And we talked about that in the first one. But the concern of the apostles on this issue is that they knew why they knew what they knew. Right? Because he says, we handled him. We saw him. We know what Jesus said because we walked with him for 3.5 years. We watched him eat. We watched him live. We touched him. He touched us. We watched him die. We saw him resurrect. We know what we know. But the concern of the apostles going forward was, how are we, those who have never seen Jesus, how do we know that? I mean, we know the things, we know things, right? We know the resurrection, and we know faith, and we know grace, and we know mercy, and we know a lot of things. But how do you know that those things are true? Well, that's the question. Now, the evidence of what we know, we say, is the eyewitness testimony, and they said that, and that's the facts about Christianity. But what about the truths about Christianity? Because there's a difference between these things. So you have the fact of the resurrection, and how do we know that Jesus really raised from the dead? That's a fact, and we call it, it's an historical fact. So if it's false, then it's a false historical fact, or it's a true one. He really did raise from the dead. But that's a fact. That's something that is an event. Okay? And so how do we know that Jesus raised from the dead? Well, we say, we know that because we have eyewitness testimony. We look at the quality and the quantity of that eyewitness testimony. We look at the New Testament and its preservation or its transmission. That's a huge evidence to the resurrection. This is why I've taken a more moderate approach on the whole concept of manuscripts and which manuscripts are quote-unquote good and bad. There are differences, and there are something that you have to look into, but I think we're a little way too far over in the extreme on this issue, because it's very important that the New Testament has a historical transmission that goes right to the shadow of the apostles. This is critical. If you go and you read people that doubt the resurrection, one of the first things they're going to do is tell you that the New Testament didn't come into being until the year 300 or later. And that's critical if you think about it, what that means, because what it's saying is then that we don't have an accurate transmission of a historical text transmitting what was said. But when we go and we look at fragments of manuscripts that have been discovered from the year 125 or 150, you're talking about, this is when they're dated to, so they're right at the feet of the apostles, and they are identical to what we have today in all substantial sense. Let me explain just how close these are. A lot of times people say, there's thousands of manuscripts and they're all very different. And it's true, depending on what you call differences, because they're handwritten. Right? So there's differences in spellings and things like that. But it's just like the Constitution. There's several copies of the Constitution, and they're all different because they were handwritten also. Right? But you look at this and you say, how close are these old manuscripts to what we have today? They are so close that they can find a piece of a manuscript that's about the size of a postage stamp, maybe a little bit bigger. And it's all tattered and torn up, and so you have about 25 or 27 letters on it. And they know exactly what book, what chapter, and what verse they are. Exactly. Because not only do the letters match what we have, but the missing spaces are identical to what you would have if you filled in the rest of it, it would work out. That's how close they are, and they're all that way. That is an incredible evidence to the fact of the resurrection, right? But what about the truth of the resurrection? Because that's different. Whether or not Christ historically raised from the dead is not really what Christianity is about. Obviously that matters. It's not that we're, Gnostics and it doesn't matter. It matters that he actually physically raised from the dead, but that's not the truth that we're talking about. The truth is, what does that mean to you? And according to, like Paul in Romans, what that means is that we died with him and we rose again with him. Our life in God is contingent on the resurrection. Now that's not a fact, that's a truth. How do you know that truth is true? How do you know that truth is right or real? I mean, you can prove the historical evidence of it, but that doesn't prove the doctrinal truth of it. And so then you can extrapolate doctrinal truth from something you've proven historically accurate, and that's good. That's what Christian doctrine is. We've taken the historical events that we have evidence for, and we should have evidence for, and then we've extrapolated out Christian doctrine or Christian truth. And that's all fine, but then this is the question that John deals with. How do you know that the truth that you hold, how do you know it? And that's what John deals with. So we talked about that through there. And so basically the book is an epistemological discussion. He is not discussing small doctrines. And by small doctrines, I mean pretty much everything. It's not about, because you got verses like where John says, you have the unction of the Spirit in you, and you don't need anyone to teach you. And people take that way over, off into la-la land, that means that they don't need to go to church, and they don't need to have a teacher, and he's saying that there's no teaching in the church. That's all nonsense. That's not at all what he's saying. That is taking that verse entirely out of the context of the book and making it mean something he never intended it to mean. But what he is saying on all these is he's saying that he is not dealing with small doctrines. He's not saying, how do you know which Bible you should use? That is not what he's talking about. I know that would be like a doctrine some of us to put right up at the top, right? And how do we know, he's not saying, how do you know that salvation is by grace? That's not at all what he's talking about. He is talking about something much more fundamental. How do you know the things that you believe? How do you know that they're truth? And so this is the evidence. He's not talking about doctrine. He is talking about something far deeper. And so he gives us, and we went through this, and I'm kind of just, summarizing what we've already looked at. But his first epistemological point was that we have to start with some foundation, a basis, a baseline fact that we can say, okay, we can agree to this as a truth, as a fundamental baseline truth. And the fundamental truth of 1 John is this: God is light, and in him there is no darkness. So that's where he starts. He says, we are going to build an epistemological argument for ourselves, not for other people, This isn't how can I prove to you that I know. That's not what it's about. This is not an apologetical book. This is an epistemological book. This is about you knowing for yourself. Not just what I know, but how I know what I know, why I know what I know, and whether or not it persuades me. And so the first point that he makes is God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. So that's where we can start, because we can all agree. And that is actually as far as I can perceive, and I basically take John's word for it, but I also have kind of thought about it. I can't conjure in my mind, I can't think in my mind any statement that would be more fundamental than that as an epistemological statement. Now, we could say God, and that's a statement, and that'd be like a baseline statement of reality, God. Or you could do one of faith, which is God is, right? And that's what Hebrews says. You have to believe that God is. And those are all fine, but they're not epistemological because they don't lead to you being able to figure anything out from those. That's just a matter of accepting it. But when we say God is light, now we have something that can be tested, and we can put other things up against and compare and reach deductions or conclusions from. So that's why that statement is so important. And it is the statement upon which the entire book is founded. So from that, he begins to build this argument. Now you got to remember, John is not building this argument for himself. This is not how they knew that they were in the truth. He explains that right at the beginning of the book. The apostles knew they were in the truth because they experienced it firsthand. This is about us. This is about the people that Peter marveled about, right? Peter writes and says, you haven't seen him, and yet you love him. And the apostles really were, as far as I can tell, blown away by this. They understood why they loved Christ. They understood why they believed in Christ. That made perfect sense. But all these people that had never seen him, never heard him, never experienced anything personally, had the same or greater love, greater faith than they did. In fact, Jesus prophesied of that, right? Jesus told Thomas that you believe because you've seen, but blessed are going to be those who believe when they don't see. And so this was an amazing thing for the apostles to see that. And so John is not discussing this for himself. He is discussing this for our benefit only, not his own. And so this is how he starts. He says, God is light, and in him there is no darkness. So how do we know that we know God? Well, we have to square that with the idea that God is light, and in him there is no darkness. And so what he says is that if we're in darkness, then we don't know him. Because God is light, and in him there is no darkness, no shadow of variance. And so the only way we can know that we know him is if we're in light. And if we're in light, it is because we know God. So that's kind of the argument he's making, right? But then he goes on and he gives his first proof then based on that statement. And it's an amazing proof. And so he says, this is the proof. This is how we know that we know God. The God of light, in whom there is no darkness, there is no sin, there is no evil. How do we know that we know him? Because we confess we're sinners. And that's what he says. If we say we haven't sinned, then we do not have the truth. We make God a liar. His truth is not in us. There is no truth in us if we say we don't sin. It would seem intuitive to think that if God is light and in him there's no darkness, and I want to prove that I know God, that then therefore I need to be without sin. And there are groups of supposed Christians who proclaim themselves to be sinless as a proof that they're Christians. John says, no, the proof that you know God is that you are a sinner. Now this is a little bit complex perhaps, but this is actually the evidence that he's given. And there's several reasons why this is the case. One, he says, first off, it's just reality. You can't know God who is light and in whom there is no darkness if you're living in a delusion. God isn't delusional. Like Josh said earlier today, he's the source of reality. And so if you're making up stories about yourself and saying, I haven't sinned, I have no sin, I'll never sin, well, you don't know God. Sure, it would make sense to think that only those who are perfect would know God because God is perfect. But nobody's perfect. He's saying that we know God and we know that we know him because we admit we're sinners. It is our admission of our faults, of our weaknesses, of our inner evil that is evidence that we know God. And that's what he goes through. Now, I don't want to go too much in that. We talked about that on the first class on this. But to me, that's just a mind-blowing evidence of how we know God. Now, John is never saying that it's okay to sin. He says, these things have I written unto you, that you sin not. He's not saying go sin to know God. He's saying that ship has already sailed. You already are a sinner. The first evidence you can have to yourself that you know God is how that you are humble and aware and confess your sin. That is evidence. So he says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins. So our sin is evidence that we know, not that we have sin, but that we know that we have sin. One way to illustrate that is, like, I don't know if this is true, but supposedly, right? How do you know if you're not crazy? Well, the fact that you ask the question is very good evidence that you're not crazy. Because crazy people don't ask that question. Crazy people, they just assume they're not crazy. They never ask it. It's sane people who have the capacity to say, maybe I'm crazy. And if you ever think, maybe I'm crazy, that's pretty good evidence to yourself you're sane. Because you can ask that question. How do we know that we know God? Because we can question ourselves and think, maybe I don't know God. The fact that we have the ability to question the matter, and we actually have some measure of self-awareness to say, how could someone like me possibly know God, it's not conclusive, but it's a very good first start, right, to how you can know that you know God. Because people that don't know God don't ask that question hardly ever. That's not a question they ask. It is Christians that torment themselves over whether or not they're really saved. Unsaved people don't have any torment whatsoever. So again, this isn't just like that's not like the mic drop evidence, but it is the first one he puts out there, saying the very first thing, if we want to have an epistemological faith, one that knows the things that it knows, we start off with that. We deal with our sin. And we find out that sin, even though it's terrible and it causes us tons of problems, there is a certain silver lining to it, right? And that is that it gives us evidence that we know God. The way we deal with our sin gives us evidence that we know God. So that's what he deals with in that first chapter. He goes on, and we're going to look at another one. And this is what we're going to look at right now is in 1 John chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. We're going to go to this one. 1 John chapter 2. And we'll look at what he says here. We dealt with, that was the first class. The second class, we dealt with the first part of this chapter where it talks about walking in light and knowing him. But now we're going to look at this. It says, Brethren, I write no new commandment unto you, but an old commandment which ye had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which ye have heard from the beginning. Now that's all very clear, but then look what he says. Again, a new commandment I write unto you, which thing is true in him and in you, because the darkness is past, and the true light now shineth. All right, so he says, so this is the second thing he's going to go into, a second big argument he's going to make on what kind of evidence we have for ourselves that the things that we know are actually true. And so he says this. He says, I write unto you no new commandment. This is an old commandment. This commandment has been around forever. Everybody knows it. There's nothing new about it. I'm not inventing anything. It's an old commandment. And then he says, again, I'm going to write a new commandment unto you. Now, it's the same commandment he's talking about. Something is different. What he's saying is, he's saying that this commandment, in one sense, there's nothing new about it. Now, I believe he's talking about the commandment of love, that you're to love your neighbor, love God, love, charity is the commandment. It is an old commandment. It is the summary of all commandments, of all law, not just Christian law or Mosaic law. It's all proper law. Any law, any law that is honest, any law that is righteous, that's the sum of it. Love. That's the old commandment. Nothing new. Find it far back as you want to go. In many, many cultures you find the same commandment. It's the same commandment everybody's had, and yet he says, when it comes to Christianity, when it comes to you as a Christian, it is a new commandment. Why is it new? What makes this new? Well, obviously something has changed. And it isn't what it says, but something has changed. And it's changed so dramatically, it's changed so fundamentally, that it can no longer be considered the same commandment, even though it sounds the same. It's not the same. It's completely different. So we're going to look at that and what this kind of tells us as we're looking at John in this context. So we're going to look at the whole concept of law and commandments and how that fits in and doesn't fit in different aspects with Christianity and with what John is talking about. And I think there's two sides that are, in my opinion, equally wrong on this. You have the one side, which is the law side, which is keeping the law. Christians ought to keep laws, and I don't care what law it is. I don't care if it's Mosaic law, Christian law, evangelical law, neo-evangelical law, Hammurabi. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference at this point which law we're talking about. But it's a rule-based Christianity. There's rules you have to keep as a Christian. Now, I think they're mistaken. Then you have the other side, and it's the lawless side of Christianity, which I think they're also mistaken, which believe grace means you can do anything you want. Now, I think they're both sadly mistaken. And I don't think the answer's in the middle. I think it's entirely different. I think that's kind of what John is pointing out, that this is something that is entirely new. I think that when we try to shoehorn Christianity and grace into anything that's pre-existing, we are making a huge mistake. I think we have to take the doctrine of Christ and the apostles as being something fundamentally new, even though it sounds old. Because this is basically what John is saying. What he says, I'm going to tell you, when you hear it, it's going to sound, you're going to say, I've always known this. But this is the epistemological side of it. You knew it, but you didn't know that you knew it, is essentially what he's saying. You didn't know it fundamentally. You didn't know it intimately. It's the difference between English has a difficulty in this, right? We only have one word for this, really, which is know. Now, if you speak other languages, more like Spanish, Greek, other languages like that, they have a number of words for knowledge because there's different kinds of knowledge. I'll give you an example. 2 + 2 = 4. That's one type of knowledge. Now, you say, I know that. Perfect. Your wife. Now, that's another kind of knowledge. Or your husband. I know them. But you don't know them the way you know that 2 + 2 = 4. That's why they surprise you every day. Right? You don't know the formula, but you know them. It's an intimate knowledge. Now, like I say, in Spanish, they actually have different words for these type of knowledges. One is the things that you saber, and the other are the things that you conocer. And they're different. And that's why the Bible uses the word, the euphemistically, right? The G-rated version of sex in the Bible is to know somebody. Because there are different ways of knowing, different types of knowledge. The old commandment, we hear it, John says, I'm going to tell you this commandment. You're going to say, this is an old commandment. We know it. We've heard it. We've always heard it. It's true. You know it. But you don't know it. Because something fundamentally changed when Christ preached this commandment. It was an old commandment, but when he preached it, it became something else entirely. And it completely upends the apple cart, in my opinion, for both sides of the equation who have taken Christianity to either be lawful or rule-based or to be, lawless or libertinage. Now, if I had to choose, if this really were a dichotomy between these two sides, well, I would choose to go with the law side. Because, in my opinion, the lawless side are insincere. They just want to do whatever they want to do, and they want justification for doing it. And I think that's very wrong. Now, I think the law side are mistaken, but I think they're sincerely mistaken. So if I had to choose, it'd be those. But I do think that there is a third way. There is something else that's not one or the other, and it's understanding what grace really is. Now, here's the problem with the way people understand grace. Well, let's talk about rules first. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about the rules first. Rules-based Christianity. That being a Christian is about keeping rules. Now, this may, like I said, it doesn't matter to me which ones we're talking about. It could be Mosaic law. It could be Noah's law, like some Christians think it is. We keep Noah's laws. Or it might be neo-evangelical laws, like don't smoke, don't drink. That's what you really run into in most churches, right? They don't keep Mosaic law. They keep neo-evangelical law, which is far worse in my opinion because it's all made up. Whole bunch of made up rules And I'm not advocating smoking. Anyone who knows me knows I'm not telling you, go smoke. You're completely missing the point if that's what you think I'm saying here. What I'm saying is we lose all credibility as Christians when we make up sins. We don't need to make them up. Okay? But that's what evangelicals do, or neo-evangelicals. They make up a bunch of sins. They make up a whole list of rules and laws that you're supposed to keep, and that's what Christianity is. And these type of Christians are what we might call the white-knuckle Christians. I mean, they're just like gripping on for dear life, hoping they keep all the rules. I know that's a little bit of a exaggerated presentation or expression of how I see it, but that's basically what I run into. It's this idea that Christianity is about what I do, doing it right, doing everything, dotting my I's, crossing my T's. That's the one side. What is the problem with this? Well, there's a lot of problems with it. But it fails to understand the limitations that are inherent in any type of law. The law is an extremely limited, extremely weak element. Extremely weak. So weak so that Paul says that the Mosaic law was overcome by sin. Sin put the Mosaic law into its service as its executioner. It says that without the law, sin has no power. Now, this doesn't mean that law is bad. It means that the law is weak, which is exactly what Paul says, that the law was weak because of our flesh, but it is weak. This is the problem. The law is only good so much as you are able to keep it. Well, that's very weak. It does have tremendous promises. If you look at Mosaic law, if you look at the city of San Antonio ordinances, they have great promises. If you do these things, things will go good for you. Great. The problem is that if you do these things, that's the problem with the law. Now, we don't have a much better option. So over the course of 7,000 years, we human beings have not devised anything better than law. If you think that lawlessness, anarchy is better than law or order, then you should go live in a place like that. And you'll come running back to law and order very quickly. It's the best system we have come up with. But it's still a very weak system. Because the law has no power over those who have no respect. We all observe this. Look, this is something we all see and we all talk about, probably all of us in this room, right? When it comes to gun laws. Gun laws are incredibly weak. They only affect the people who are already not going to abuse them. So if we pass a law that says, right, you can't have guns, it is not going to take one gun out of one criminal's hand. There's not a single person who's going out at night to kill somebody saying, oh, there's a law against shooting, I guess I'll have to use a knife. I mean, we all understand this. This is so ridiculous. Gun laws do not keep bad people from doing bad things. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't have laws. It just means we should understand there is a serious problem with law. A serious defect in it. It's inherent. It is impossible for us to overcome it. We can't. It doesn't mean we get rid of all the laws. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we should be honest with ourselves about what the problems with the laws are. And there are inherent difficulties with it. Like Paul says, right, that they perish with the using. In other words, there's destruction in them. As much order as they bring and reputable, and that they have a certain amount of wisdom in them, at the same time, they have a certain amount of self-destruction in them. And so these are the problems with the law. The law always is after the fact. There are crimes and sins that do not exist today that will exist tomorrow. And tomorrow they will not be illegal. Maybe the day after they will, but the law always comes after the sin. It never is before. It's always after. It's always a response to. This is very problematic because it's already been done by the time the law's made. There are financial maneuverings that people did back in the 2000s that caused tremendous problems in our economy, and they were legal. Now, they're probably immoral, but they were legal. Now we have laws against that kind of stuff, and we say, okay, now we're protected. Against that, maybe, but they are constantly inventing new ways to manipulate the system. And the law will always be 3 days late. Always. So these are the problems with the law. Now let's talk about liberty, because if you got the other side of the coin, the Christians, and this is most evangelical Christians, right? They're very much against the idea of law, against the idea of rules. No, we don't. This is modern Christianity. Old evangelical Christianity was in love with the rules. Don't smoke, don't drink, don't cuss, don't gamble. You can't play cards. I grew up in a home where you couldn't play poker. Not even for fun. And you couldn't, not only could you not play poker, you couldn't play with face cards. That's what we called them. I don't know if that's what you call them, but poker cards or regular deck of cards, you couldn't play any game with those cards. Those cards were sin, even if you're playing Go Fish. So those Christians, the Evangelical Baptists of Texas, invented 42. And I assume those of you know, most of you know here what 42 is, the domino game. That is playing cards without playing cards. That's why it looks just like a card game. Because it is. In fact, you can play 42 with a deck of cards. And you can play card games with a thing of dominoes. But that's how they thought. That was that side. Now the neo-evangelical, the new evangelical side is not that. They're not worried at all about rules. They're like, no rules. We have grace. This is the problem with that perspective of grace. It's not grace. That is not grace. I can do whatever I want and nobody can tell me I can't. That's not grace. That is not grace. What is the problem with this version of grace? The problem with this version of grace is it does not take into account at all what the Bible talks about in this matter. Their view of grace is pretty simple. It basically goes something along the lines of this. They may not say it in these words, but this is how it goes. So grace in their view is this. The law of Moses was hard and heavy and deadly and horrible. And Christ came and took us out of the law of Moses and gave us grace. And it's easy and nice and kind, and we can all do it. That is not the law of Moses, and that is not grace. That is a perversion of both sides. Grace is not less harsh than the law, any law. It's not. You need to read Hebrews. We do not have time to roll Hebrews into First John, right? But if you read Hebrews, this is very clear right from this is how it starts. I mean, he doesn't even give an introduction. It's just like God, right, who spoke in times past to the fathers, by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. And then he has big parentheses, and he jumps to chapter 2. In chapter 2, what does he say? Therefore we must give more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest we slip. For if the word spoken by the angels was steadfast, and all disobedience received just recompense of reward, how much more will be it for those who disregard the word of the Son? So what is he saying? Grace, John says grace was made by Jesus Christ. So we think, oh, Jesus brought grace, which is this much lovelier, softer, more tender, easier version of faith than what we had in the Old Testament. No, that is not true. It is much harsher, much more strident, much more stringent, much more deadly than anything in the Old Testament ever pretended to be. If you disobeyed, he says, the word of the angels, they would come down and burn you up. But if you disobey the word of the Son, you'll not only die physically, you'll be condemned to hell. The Son is not less harsh, severe than the angels or Moses or the prophets or whoever else. Not less, more. This Christ, he illustrated this with his parable. He said that he had a vineyard, he leased his vineyard out to people, and when it came time to collect the rent, he sent prophets, sent his servants. They went, they'd beat him up, they'd send him away. We're not giving you, send him away, send him away. Finally he says, I'm going to send him my Son. Surely when they see it's the Son, they'll pay the rent. So he sends the Son. They look at him and say, look, it's the heir. If we kill him, We can keep the vineyard. So they kill him. And then Jesus asked them the question, what is the king going to do now? And they answered truthfully. He's going to destroy them all. That's right. They could kill and beat and torment the prophets, and he would just keep sending more. The moment they killed the son, that was it. Now, this isn't an anti-Semitism point. This is an anti-humanity point. You understand? This is not about Jews or nationality. That's not the point. The point here is, if you disregard the word of the Son, that is far, far worse than disobeying Moses. Far worse. It's not even close. In fact, what Hebrews tells us is, and 2 Corinthians chapter 3 also makes this point, is that we're not just talking about differences in degrees. A lot of times we think Jesus is greater than the angels. It's true. He is greater than the angels, but not in degrees. Not like Jesus is a better angel. You know, difference in degrees is like where you would say, right, a Ferrari is better than a Ford. That's difference in degrees. Hebrews is saying that Jesus is categorically better. That's like saying the tree of life is better than a Ford. Yeah, a lot better. Immeasurably better. Categorically better. This is what people who have a low or cheap appreciation of grace are not understanding. Grace is not less. Grace is not easier. So how is that? Okay, so here's the difference between real grace, right, and any type of law or rules. It's not that grace doesn't have law or rules or commandments. In fact, John says, the old commandment is the new commandment. So it's not that there are no commandments in grace. There are lots of them. In fact, lots is just a way of expression. It's really not the right expression, though, and that's the point. So here's the problem with law. It's enumerated, right? You have commandments, however many they are, whether it's the 10 commandments, the 618 commandments, whether it's 3,000 commandments, 3 billion commandments. It doesn't matter how many you have a finite list of them. And they're always just a day short. They're always just a sentence too short. There's always a loophole in them. There's always some version of reality they don't fit to. It's like Worldcraft, I think it's called, that video game, Worldcraft. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's this video game where you make these little Minecraft. That's Minecraft, there you go. Minecraft, you got this video game, and you guys should not know that game. Anyways, you got this video game, and you build all these things. But if you ever seen it, it's funny because even to this day, when we have all this high-definition graphics, it's real blocky. Right? It's just these big blocks. And the people are blocky. Everything's blocky. That's the law. Very blocky. Any law, I don't care which law we're talking about, it's low resolution. Grace is real, which means there is no pixelation. So Christians under grace say, well, what can I not do and what can I do? You don't understand what grace is. Sure, there are things you shouldn't do. Lots and lots and lots and lots of them. And there are things you should do. Lots and lots and lots and lots of them. But there is no list telling you what it is. So then how do you know? Well, because you have the unction in yourself. There is no more effective law than the law that comes from within. It's the only law that actually works. It's the only one that works. Any law imposed externally will never work. We've tried it for thousands of years. It never works. But a law that comes from within always works. Anyone here who's had a business, you have a question?
So that's what that verse means, that you don't need anyone to teach you because...
It goes towards that. It's not just that, but yes, that is a huge component of it in my view. There's actually more to it than that, but yes, exactly. And this is what this passage, he says, you have a new commandment. What's new about it? He says, it's true in God and it's true in you. What's the difference between the old commandment and the new commandment? The old commandment was never true in anybody. It was always true, but it was never true in you. The new commandment is different. It sounds the same. Sounds exactly the same. You look at the New Testament, the Old Testament, you look at the New Testament and the law of Hammurabi, you look at the New Testament, any just law anywhere in the world, they sound very much the same. A lot of people try to make hay that you look at Jesus saying, do unto others as you want them to do unto you, and say, we can find that all over the place. There's nothing new about that. This isn't innovative. No, there's nothing new about those words. They're everywhere. They're the basis of all true law. But they are new. It's not what they say that makes them new. It's where they're said. The law of Christ is in us. It's not a law imposed upon us. Christians that are saying, okay, what do I have to do to be a good Christian? Do not understand grace. Do not understand Christ. Grace isn't about what you can and can't do. Grace is about willing to do what you should. An entirely different discussion. It's not the opposite of it. It's just entirely different. Grace, according to Paul, is basically that says that God works in us to will and to do His good pleasure. It's not, I get to do what I want. It's that I want to do what I should. Entirely different. And that's why it's a new commandment. So, he says, we're talking about then this difference, right? So you have the law and the grace, and this cheapened grace, which is about no one can tell me what to do. And one of the most common questions that I'm asked in Mexico mainly, and I get a lot of questions in Mexico when I travel there. And one of the most common questions I get is, can I X? Can I dance? Can I smoke? Can I drink? And they're looking for someone to give them a law and say, yes. And of course, my answer is always the same. Can you? Well, how do I know? Now, that isn't to say that there's nothing in life that isn't absolutely immoral and wrong. Fornication, obviously, is wrong. Adultery is wrong. Murder is wrong. Most Christians are not battling with those things. I don't think they are Christians if they are battling with those ideas. What they're talking about is another level of things. What should I eat? What should I drink? What should I smoke? What should I inhale? Who should I be with? Who should I be friends with? What places should I frequent? These are the questions they're asking, and they're looking for a set of rules. And this is the problem with the law, like I said. It's enumerated. It doesn't matter how long your list is. It is a list. It is finite, and it always falls short. But if you have the righteousness of faith in you, flowing out of you like a mighty river with no pixelation, real life resolution, it applies to everything. That's the unction that you don't need anyone to teach you. Most of the time when you and I are asking, can I, or should I, or may I do whatever, we are not really in any doubt as to whether we should do it. We are looking for someone to tell us yes, so that we can silence our own conscience and do what we know we shouldn't be doing. That's why the Bible says that to know to do good and not to do it is sin. And whatever is not of faith is sin. We don't need any more of a list of laws or rules or ordinances than that for ourselves. Now, we have to raise children. We have to have a society. All of these things require law. I am not an anarchist. I am not saying we shouldn't have laws and lists and rules and ordinances. That's not what I'm saying. You're missing the point if you think that's what I'm saying. And the reason I emphasize that is because I've had a discussion recently in Spanish, and the result of it has been that a bunch of the people that hear me are like, see, we knew it. Michael said we can do anything we want. You have not understood a word I've said if you think that's what I am saying. What I'm telling you is that this discussion is an entirely different discussion than law or no law, rule or no rule. It is not that discussion. If you're on that level and that's your discussion, you have missed the point. You've missed the point. The point here is about what grace really is. Now, going back to 1 John, and I got to wrap it up. So going back to 1 John, what John is saying here is that our understanding of this, what the law is for us, that it is true in us. That I don't need to go and say, where's the book of the law? Where's the tables of the law? Where's the pastor of the law? Where's the church, constitution that tells me what to do and what not to do? I need to know, what should I do in this moment? The fact that I know in me, without a doubt, I know I shouldn't do that. Doesn't matter if everyone else says it's okay. Every one of you can tell me there's nothing wrong with it, but it's wrong to me. That is very good evidence that I know God, because that is a new commandment. No one had that before. If you have that, then you have an unction of the Spirit. Now, we may not all agree on what we should and shouldn't do, and that's the amazing thing about the New Testament. Paul says there's freedom in that. Some people celebrate one day and others don't. Some people eat one thing and others don't. He says they both do it unto the Lord. As long as they're doing it unto the Lord, fully persuaded in their own minds, they are living out the new commandment, which is the old commandment. But it's new now because it's true in you, not just in him. And we got to end with that. So, 11 o'clock, we'll start up again.